Good evening, folks. I'm Ross Weaver. I'm back one last time to do one more of my Metal Gear Solid V Explained lectures in the whole series. We're going to end with lecture number 27. I'm going to just call it Kojima's Method. We're going to go into a couple of big things that he uses stylistically in this game, in the Phantom Pain, to accomplish his storytelling. The two big ones are references and called the no-cuts method. But first, to get into the references stuff, and before you even get into Kojima's stuff, let's talk about David Lynch. If you know anything about Kojima, you know he's a David Lynch fan. He liked Twin Peaks, I'm pretty sure, when it first aired, and they don't have like an explicit history together of things they've collaborated on or anything like that. There's not a lot of videos you can find of them talking or anything like that. It's more like they're contemporaries in a creative sense, and they kind of use the same kind of storytelling methods, let's say. So David Lynch, for me, the biggest thing in my mind when I think of David Lynch using references is something that I have to give credit to somebody else for, actually, that pointed it out to me. There's a YouTube creator you need to go check out. Her name is Maggie Mae Fish, and that's spelled Maggie, Maggie. Mae is Mae, and then Fish is Fish. And go check her out. She's got a video, two videos, kind of going into Twin Peaks: The Return and Fire Walk with Me, and kind of breaking down a lot of the stuff behind those movies' makings and the sort of the narrative stuff going on mechanically behind the scenes. And one of the things she points out, and I think it's about 30 minutes into her first video in these two video series, she's talking about Fire Walk with Me, referencing Silence of the Lambs. And she points out Silence of the Lambs came out in theaters right while Twin Peaks was airing and while they were making the Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me script. So it totally fits. They totally could have looked at Silence of the Lambs and been like, oh yeah, we're just going to put this in our script. And that seems to be what they did in many cases. She makes a pretty good comparison between autopsy scene in Fire Walk with Me and the autopsy scene in Silence of the Lambs. She points out the painting of the wallpapered room with the door, the wallpaper kind of matching the wallpaper in Buffalo Bill's house, and that whole sequence for Clarice in that house kind of matching up with stuff from Fire Walk with Me with Laura. So she explains this way better than I can. So go watch her video. Go check that out if you want to know more about Lynch's use of reference in Twin Peaks specifically, because there's a lot more that I just don't have time to go into here. But on the same kind of David Lynch note, this is not something Maggie goes into. This is something I wanted to mention. There's a curious thing in Twin Peaks: The Return that I always have to mention. In I think it's episode 3 of The Return. It's the episode where Dougie kind of comes back, or you would say Cooper comes back as Dougie, and he gets taken by Jade to the casino, kind of walks around, and hits a bunch of jackpots, and some funny stuff happens there. But while he's walking around in that casino at one point, there's this just let's say seemingly pointless shot. You could probably imagine a version of this scene, this whole sequence existing without this particular shot, where it's just a shot of some slot machines in the background, and Dougie walks into frame and kind of looks around and then walks out of frame. And that's about it. It's a classic David Lynch shot. He's like, I don't give a shit what you think. We're going to get the shot, I love it. And while this shot is happening, on the background on one of the slot machines, you can see pop up a Konami splash screen, a Konami logo. If you look up that slot machine, it's a Konami slot machine. Konami's got like a lot of gaming stuff in gambling and all that sector of the gaming business, so it could just be a coincidence, right? Well, if you watch every other shot in Twin Peaks: The Return that's in a slot machine area in the casinos, they almost never show any of those. In fact, I don't think I've seen a single other machine show a splash screen with a logo on it. And that's common sense if you know anything about filmmaking. if you're shooting in a casino and you don't have the rights for all of those, let's say, trademarked logos that are going to pop up there, you can't use that unless you've got permission. Especially when you're making something like Twin Peaks: The Return, that's why you see a lot of Apple laptops opened on shows with a Post-it note covering the Apple logo. It's because the company that's shooting that Apple logo on their scene has to actually pay Apple to use Apple's trademark within their own product, essentially, right? And so this means in the making of Twin Peaks: The Return, a Konami logo came up in a shot that seemingly could have just been removed. You can't find it anywhere else in the whole series like that. And instead of it being removed, it is there. And presumably they paid Konami for the right to use Konami's logo in that shot. Why would they do that? I don't think David Lynch is going to explain it to us, essentially. But I think that it was, if you ask me, it's just a hint. It's just a little it's a little nod. I think at the time that Kojima was crafting all of his stuff for the Phantom Pain was probably the same time that Lynch was crafting all of his stuff for The Return. And I want to say The Return, Kojima's openly talked about on Twitter, actually. I think he showed his whole entire company, a bunch of them, Twin Peaks: The Return, when he was making, was it Death Stranding, I believe? Anyway, he can go look that up. I may be misremembering that, but he's, like I said, he's a fan. Kojima likes Lynch's stuff, and there's probably some hidden connections that you can find between Lynch's work and Kojima's work going back throughout the years if you really dig into it. Because like I said, I think that Kojima's been a fan of Lynch's work going back to when Twin Peaks first aired in Japan, and possibly even before that. So, with all of that said, what's the deal with using references at all? Why do people use references? It seems to kind of be a little weird, right, to expect audiences of your movie to know a whole other movie's context and stuff to understand your movie, right? Well, I don't think it's that crazy, actually, especially when you're talking about Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is a narrative that's set explicitly kind of in TV land, right? So if it's a movie version of it, it makes sense that it's also kind of set in movie land, right? And so other movies kind of, if you ask me, kind of have to influence it in a way, in order for it to be kind of true to what it is, right? And so it makes sense that story stuff in Twin Peaks probably always came from other TV shows and other stuff that Lynch had watched over the years on TV and soap operas and dramas and whatnot. And I've never gone back and checked it myself, but I kind of wonder how much of the original 2 seasons of Twin Peaks was built out of already existing referential material, essentially. If he did it in Fire Walk with Me with such a kind of gusto, kind of. If you go watch the Maggie Mae Fish video, it's like incredibly obvious. Like it hits you in the face if you haven't if you don't think about it and you don't look at it. But at the time, if you were a regular moviegoer in 1990, say 92, and you had seen Silence of the Lambs, you'd go see Fire Walk with Me. Not long later, you might be able to put it together. So I think the same thing is going on with the Phantom Pain. And I've kind of talked about how, these stories that we play through are symbolic of other stories that exist within the Phantom Pain. But as a whole, Metal Gear has already kind of been doing this, except it didn't start by referencing its own story. It had to start by building its story out of stuff outside of itself, right? And so I've talked about kind of the Terminator reference in the original Metal Gear game and stuff like that. But the mechanics of why you would do this kind of gets into... essentially, if you've ever seen a story and it kind of dissatisfied you and you wanted to see it go in a different direction or see it in a different context, well, that's why you as a storyteller would do this. You give an homage to a story that you liked, but you wanted to see it a little different, so instead of just copying it, you kind of give your version of the same story, right? It's a way of taking a story beat or story beats and applying them to other contexts, essentially. That's the basic of what a reference really is. And so if you don't have this other context, it's kind of like a cipher key, right? You kind of need the cipher and the key, or the code and the cipher key to decode it. And the cipher key is kind of in this other work. And in this way, this allows you to recontextualize the meaning of the original work without actually changing the original work, because the original work's still there, and you're just referencing it with your homage and your references and stuff. Your story can be totally different. You can end it quite a different way or do something really different and recontextualize this other work. And you're not just creating your story out of what is in your work. It's also kind of got this hidden link to this other work. And when you compare it all together, you get this extra commentary, this kind of interplay between the two works. That extra recontextualization from this other work kind of plays into this other work's own story itself. You see what I'm saying? It kind of fills in the gaps that you might not get as to like why, because a lot of times homages in a lot of film and just media in general, they seem sometimes a little out of context. Like you just don't get it, right? And you have to get the reference. So in a way, this is like time travel. This is like what I was talking about with the Thomas Mann quote as well, with how an artist's ability to recontextualize your own past within your present experience is kind of a revenge on your own past. It's kind of time travel. You're kind of like going back in time a little bit in your own head, maybe you could say, and putting things in a different light. Maybe shifting your perspective on it. And so, like the big examples of this in the Phantom Pain are really, I've mentioned this before. Donnie Darko's a big one. The Andromeda strain is a really big one. The Final Countdown is a less big one to this one. Final Countdown is more important to Metal Gear Survive, but it also plays into the whole V kind of experience. And I've talked more, in this whole lecture series about a whole lot of other references. You can go back over this whole lecture and, I'm sure come up with a good list of them. I don't have them all written down here. I apologize. But to go into another example of one, if you noticed in my Metal Gear Decoded videos, the 5-video series, I had a stack of movies next to me, and I talked about the Final Countdown and Andromeda Strain and Donnie Darko, and there's some other movies in that stack that I didn't talk about. One of them is Tron Legacy, the sequel to Tron that came out, I think it was like a decade ago. And the one with the Daft Punk soundtrack, which is like maybe the best soundtrack ever made. It's so incredible. But anyways, without getting lost there, Tron Legacy in many ways is referenced in The Phantom Pain because it predates it. And there's a lot of structural kind of overarching stuff that's going on there. But essentially, in the movie, and I'm not going to go through explaining the movie Tron Legacy, so if you haven't seen it, I apologize. But I can't just sit here and provide a whole synopsis of it. Go check it out yourself. But in the movie Clue, he's this kind of copier and is himself kind of a copy of Flynn, right? So in a way, Clue stands in for the AI, really, and how Fox, after all of this stuff with Big Boss, has to deal with all this AI stuff. And that's really who the bad guy is throughout the rest of the Metal Gear series after Big Boss is deposed. It's sort of like the AI becomes the Times itself, in a way. And so it's like if Clue is the AI, then the old Flynn, the guy that's been there at the beginning of the Tron Legacy movie, he's kind of old Fox. He's kind of Frank Hunter. He's the guy who's, he's kind of been in the system, for a while, right? He's a master of this world, but he's also kind of an old man, and he's not like he's not like omnipotent and so it's like, how Flynn is kind of this original and Clue is kind of a copy. It's like how the AI keeps reproducing these story things that are happening within the Cypher Collective. So even once Big Boss is deposed, all of his experiments kind of continue on via the AI, which he built. But, Clue's not really Big Boss himself. You can kind of make some comparisons there, but, oh gosh, I can't remember his name, but there's the guy who was in the first movie that gets turned against. He's kind of more of a Big Boss. Anyways, so Clue is more like the AI. And so if Flynn is like Fox, then we have Sam Flynn that comes in, the younger Flynn. He's like Chico. He's the new guy, and he's the one who's kind of like discovering all this old stuff that's already been going, and then kind of comes in with his own power, can sort of change things just enough and provides enough of a force of change to sort of tip the scales in the right way that they need to go for old Flynn to kind of deal with this clue problem, the AI problem, right? And to kind of go along with it, Sam Flynn's kind of companion during that whole story is Quorra. She's kind of like quiet. She's kind of the biodigital jazz, man. You know, she's kind of pure parasite, right? She's kind of pure artifice itself, artifice as life. There's a lot more that you can compare between Tron Legacy and Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain, but those are kind of the basics. Clue's kind of the AI and kind of Big Boss's legacy. Old Flynn is kind of Old Fox. Sam Flynn is Chico, and Quorra is quiet. And I'm pretty sure Kojima, did this on purpose. I think he liked Tron Legacy quite a bit. And so another good example of just a quick one of a more specific reference. There are structural references, right, which are like big or overarching ones. But there's also specific ones where like a specific shot will be almost just like a straight up copy from something else, right? And so a good example of that is in the hospital scenario when Ishmael unscrews his silencer and throws it through the air. That's a 2001 Space Odyssey reference with the bone that's hucked in the air by the ape at the beginning, which in that movie there's a series of cuts of the bone in the air. And after one of the cuts, it just cuts to, there's like bone, 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 and then the bone becomes space station floating in the sky. And so we don't use cuts in the Phantom Pain, though. So instead of cuts, it uses slow-mo. Sort of a zero shift, right? But it's more or less the same kind of idea going on in the close-up of that thing being hurled through the air. And the silencer itself being black and the lighting and everything kind of gives it a little bit of a monolithic look, I would say. There's even a type of silencer that's called a monolith. That's more of a flat-sided one, anyways, without getting distracted. So speaking of no cuts, we've talked enough about references for you to kind of get what's going on with the referential stuff. Again, if you want to find out more about some of the hidden references in the Phantom Pain, the only way to do it is watch other media and then go back and watch the Phantom Pain again with the other media in mind and see what clicks. I can tell you a lot about what I've figured out, but there's Kojima watches so many movies, y'all. He watches so much stuff and reads so many books. He absorbs so much story that I doubt I'm going to be up to the task of tracking all of that down. It's probably going to be a group effort if anybody's able to do it. So check it out yourself and see what you find. You'll probably have some fun with that. So I mentioned the no cuts thing and how we're going to talk about also the other big part of the method used to make this game work is there's no cuts in anything. Generally speaking, a long take or a no cut style is mostly used for sort of like drawing the audience in a more realistic kind of stream of consciousness experience. Cutting in a general sense in the film language, it's a very disruptive thing, right? There's a way you can make a good cut work if you do it on the right moment with the right action and the right sound cue from the right angle to the other angle. It can all kind of work a little bit more smoothly for the audience's viewing experience, right? There's also ways you can do bad cuts where a lot of modern movies like to do lots of cuts and sometimes they get a little bit disorienting, right? If you know about the 180 degree rule, you know that if you cut across the 180 degree line and people's characters' positions in the frame swap, it can be very disorienting for the audience to determine what the space is doing, essentially, right? And what the characters are doing in the space and everything. So a no-cut style keeps space consistent, and it keeps kind of your perspective consistent, and it draws you in a more realistic way. On the flip side, some people will say that it gets a little boring, essentially. Some people like to see, we want to see the cuts to the action and see what's going on, right? And it's more of a Hollywood way. It's more of a learned, developed style to do things that way. If you get into the history of essentially cutting, you get back to how, the first films were long takes, single takes. It was a lot of it was due to just how film was made when it was first made. But the Lumiere brothers, it was essentially they'd set up a camera and sort of just start it cranking, and they'd keep cranking until the film was done, and that was it. It was a few seconds of like people coming out of a factory, or walking down a street or something, and it was very short little. You wouldn't call them films, but they were the first films, right? They were made on film, motion pictures, and all that. And so cutting was something that came later. And so cutting, like I said, stylistically is more of an artificial thing, right? It's something that's learned. It's not something that's natural. So saying that there's no cuts here is a way of sort of taking some of the artifice out of it, in a way, and sort of making you feel like everything that's happening is real. Ironically speaking, this is a video game, right? We know whenever something goes off camera, they can do whatever they want. As soon as a model is off camera, it can totally despawn, and when the camera flips back, it could just not be there, right? It's not like a real-life movie production where the actor has to be yanked off the set when the camera pans back or something like that, right? They can do some tricky stuff in a video game. And so by employing the no-cuts method and then also doing this tricky stuff, they can really kind of screw with us a lot, actually. And that is what happens in The Phantom Pain. But just some kind of like notable things about the no-cut style. The first thing I want to talk about is there's a famous story about Hayao. I'm terrible at pronouncing his first name. Hayao Miyazaki. Miyazaki sent Harvey Weinstein a katana and said no cuts on it, essentially. When I can't remember which film it was, but one of Miyazaki's films was being published and released by the Weinstein Company, or maybe produced even too. And Harvey Weinstein's, back in his history, he was known for kind of being a little overbearing in his influence on the films he was involved with, and demanding shorter cuts and demanding his way and stuff like that. And Miyazaki had a way of telling him no cuts by sending him a blade, essentially a katana. And I only bring that up again because the blade. This relates to Fox's blade, essentially. Like a blade itself is kind of related to cuts, right? In editing and film, with the Miyazaki story, everybody kind of knows that it's legendary. So this is, I think, why Fox's sword is kind of absent, you would say, in many of these games. It's in like Rising Revengeance and Metal Gear Solid 1, it's there. It's in Metal Gear Solid 2. Arguably, it's not there in 4. They use machetes and kind of high-frequency blades, but none of them, none of them appear to be using Fox's blade in 4. So it's kind of gone. It's the blade itself gets cut, right? And I think it just kind of ties in with the contexts in which we see the knife appear, Venom's knife appear in this game. And other knives as well, possibly. But I'm pretty sure the only other knife that we see that's not Venom's knife, I think Eli steals a knife from just some random soldier at one point. And there maybe are a couple of other knives, too. I think Quiet gets one from another soldier. Something like that, but even in any of those cases, Eli is kind of a stand-in for Fox, right? So his blade is kind of Fox's blade. Quiet, at a point when she steals a knife, again, she's kind of Chico, right? She is Fox. So it's another stand-in for Fox's blade. So the no cuts thing also kind of relates to the blade. So you can just kind of think of whenever the knife comes up in a segment, think of no cuts, as in like, what does Venom say when he stabs himself? Is like, we don't draw our weapons on other people, right? We're not supposed to use these weapons on our allies, essentially, is kind of the lesson here. So you can think of like Miyazaki telling Weinstein no cuts is kind of like Venom Snake telling Eli, you're going to learn to use this and not use it on your friends, basically. Anyways, a really good famous example of the long take method. Now, the no cuts method is also sometimes called just long take method, because obviously making an entire film with no cuts was more or less impossible until fairly recently with digital technology, because film, the reel length is limited, right? to load up enough film for 2 hours of filming, or however long, even 90 minutes, would just be absurd. You'd have to make a truck or something. But anyways, big famous early example of a film that utilized the long take method It was 1948's Rope by Alfred Hitchcock. A lot of people say this is not their favorite Hitchcock film, and I remember when I watched it the first time, I was kind of a little underwhelmed by the overall story and the overall kind of presentation of the film. It had some great moments. It's a classic Hitchcock film in many respects, but it doesn't quite, if you've already seen, say, Dial M for Murder or whatever. If you've seen some of Hitchcock's other stuff like Vertigo, let's say, or Psycho, Rope can maybe kind of underwhelm you a little bit if you have high expectations. But it's a really well-made film. And it utilizes the long take method, like I've said, to sort of heighten the sense of reality and sort of heighten your sense of suspense a little bit in some cases. Because you know that you're locked in the camera's perspective and you can't see what's going on off of this view, he can kind of mess with you in a little bit like that. Another name, another name for a long take itself is a oneer. It's, like I've said, it's kind of a Hollywood technique nowadays, to do a oneer, to call for a single long shot to record a scene. But it's also, like I said, it was kind of the original way to do films, and then later kind of the cutting way of doing everything shot by shot kind of became the standard. And now we've flipped around where the oneer has become kind of a Hollywood technique again. And it's like it's a specific thing you ask for. And it's not like seen as the standard way to do things, right? If you want to see some other people who use long takes specifically, I've got a few written down here that are some of my favorites. Paul Thomas Anderson does this in a lot of his films. Magnolia is the big standout one that I think of. He has some long takes in that film that are devastating. Oh my God. The classic master of the Italian spaghetti western, Sergio Leone, could not have done what he did in his films without utilizing long takes. He uses sort of like less editing, you could say, in a lot of ways to accomplish what he accomplishes in his films. And then to go around the world a little more, Yasujiro Ozu, a great Japanese master of film before and after World War II, but especially his post-World War II stuff gets more of the play probably nowadays, but his pre-World War II stuff was still really good. Ozu loved to use long takes as well. Ozu also liked to use a lot of very distinct sort of like camera stylistics that you don't see in modern Hollywood today. And so I would highly recommend, if you've never seen an Ozu film, to go check him out. Ozu and Kurosawa are kind of the two masters from Japanese cinema post-war, but Ozu in many ways is more interesting if you're looking for like the long take style and more of a contemplative film, although Rashomon's plenty contemplative, don't get me wrong. But stylistically, Ozu's, like I said, he's a little more paced out and considered in a lot of ways. Kind of an older style of making movies. So, another guy who uses both long takes and references, kind of a twofer here, Jean-Luc Godard. Go check out Breathless. If you've never seen Breathless, there's Homage used in Breathless. I'm not going to go into it because I haven't seen it since film school, and I probably need to refresh myself on Godard, but there's all kinds of stuff going on in his whole filmography, really, about Homage. But Breathless is the big one probably there. And, of course, I've already mentioned David Lynch. He does long takes also. He does references in other works as well, but he loves to not cut. If you've ever watched Eraserhead, when the small chickens are at the table and they're put in front of Eraserhead, in front of the main character there, what does he do? Well, he doesn't cut, actually. He doesn't cut the chickens at all, right? He doesn't cut. And what does the film do? It doesn't cut. He uses a long take there. It's like as a way of saying Lynch isn't afraid to like stare at something for a real long damn time, as long as it takes to get whatever you need out of it, right? And that kind of plays into why the chickens do what they do in that scene. So you can go back and check that one out. Another one that's just, I would say, kind of the most well-known one that you probably know, even if you don't realize it, Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino doesn't use long takes as much, but he does have plenty of good long take stuff in his oeuvre, in his whole repertoire. The best one I want to say is, I think Hateful Eight has some really good long takes in it, but I need to rewatch that one. I'm pretty sure there's some pretty good long takes in that film, though. But also, if anybody loves to use homage, it's Tarantino. In many ways, I want to say Tarantino's probably a lot like Kojima in that a lot of Tarantino's films are just probably built in his head out of literally, oh, I want to take this shot from this film, and then next do this shot from this film, and next do this shot from this film. I think he's got a pretty categorically visual mind about all the stuff he's seen, and so when I think he comes up with a story that he wants to tell, he can pretty much come up with, oh, this movie did this thing already that I want to do, so he just copies from it, essentially, and pays homage in the process. Because it's like, you don't want to just go out and just copy story stuff that other storytellers have already been doing and just ignore what they've been doing. That's kind of silly, right? And it kind of is like you're wasting an opportunity there by playing off of the other stories that already exist. And so that's kind of the point of references, is it kind of gives you like an extra, kind of an extra dimension or an extra pool of ideas to pull in for your own story. And with that said, that's all I've got. I'm done. There's no more for me really to say about Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain in these lectures. That I've gone back over these lectures, and there's definitely some stuff I left out that I'd like to go back and cut in if I could. Lord help me. I'm not going to do a George Lucas though. I made them the way I made them, and we're going to leave them how they are. We're not gonna get all artificial and start messing with the context afterwards, right? We don't need to do that. There's been enough of that. So, in many ways, I think this game's making it this way, right? Why did he do this at all? I think it's kind of a commentary, a warning about the times, right? About how if we don't allow room for these types of works of art, they'll go away. We'll just have surface level kind of, let's call it slop, just surface level drama stuff in all of our movies with no greater meaning thought of in their making or to be found, if you look beyond yourself, right? In a way, Kojima's putting all this stuff in there to kind of make this art hold up over time. Because like I said, I think this was kind of a piece that he made to walk away from, right? This wasn't meant to be just another Metal Gear Solid game. This was meant to be kind of a big statement Metal Gear Solid game, and probably his last big statement Metal Gear Solid game. And so, you don't want to just give everybody that, that big finale, like I said, right there, early on. You don't want to, you don't want to ruin the climax, right? You don't want to hit the crescendo too early and let's say blow the whole load too early, right? A good work of art, like I've said before, is something that you should be able to return to over the years and kind of reinterrogate it and find new stuff every time, right? If you keep coming back to a work of art and you can't find anything new, well then, that work of art may not be as great as another one that you can keep coming back to because you might not be able to enjoy it as much, quite literally, right? And so that's why I think he's made this filled with so many kind of missing gaps and references that you have to go track down yourself, and with all this kind of, let's say, deceptive filmmaking employed against us. This kind of, in a way, it's kind of anti-Hollywood filmmaking, right? He's kind of using the Hollywood format against us to point out how Hollywood itself kind of uses this stuff sort of against us without us really even knowing. And so, with that all said, hopefully you know a little bit more about what's going on in these games now. If you've watched all these lectures, I really appreciate it, y'all. I'm going to say it here because I haven't said it elsewhere. My channel's not monetized, and I don't ever intend to monetize my channel. I don't even reach the monetization requirements for YouTube right now. But I could probably, once I hit 500 subscribers, I could probably monetize it if I wished, and I'm not gonna. I don't have any desire to get paid by YouTube doing these videos. I'm sure there's enough ads getting thrown up on these videos as it is, and I don't like advertising. Just philosophically speaking, I think advertising is kind of silly the way we do it in TV, especially. but the internet too, anyways. So I don't want to throw in any more ads. And like I said, I've got my own job. I can support myself, and I can do these videos on my own with my own stuff. I'm a videographer, as a living. This is what I do. So this is just kind of fun stuff for me to do on the side. I don't need to get paid for it, and so I'm not going to ask for money for it. So if y'all see anybody out there asking money for these videos, let me know. This stuff is, in my mind, it's educational content, and educational content's meant to be made, distributed for free. It's not meant to be, capitalized upon and profited from. I think that's another one of the reasons why Kojima made the Phantom Pain so apocryphal. It's so Konami can't come along and just easily capitalize upon a nice, neat story that he's tied up in a bow. They've got kind of a mess really here, right? If they want to continue telling another Metal Gear game, right? How are you going to follow up the Phantom Pain, right? I mean, well, they did with Survive, right? But like, how are you going to follow it up with like another mainline game, right? It's kind of a tall order. Hopefully, after watching all these lectures, you could see how they could do it. It could be done. Might not be very pretty, but it could definitely be done. But anyways, that's all I've got for this whole lecture series. Again, hope y'all have enjoyed. I've got more video stuff coming in the future for Metal Gear and for possibly other games. Hope you've enjoyed. Have a nice night. Peace.